Owen didn't hear it from me. By the time he stood in front of the house and saw the sign in the yard, the decision had already been made. The offer was accepted, the paperwork was moving, and there was nothing left for him to influence. I had already agreed to sell it. He called me that day. More than once. I watched his name light up my phone and let it stop on its own. I told myself I needed time to figure out how to explain everything in a way that wouldn't turn into an argument I couldn't control. I never found that version of the explanation. I told myself I wasn't hiding anything permanent, that I would sit down with him once things were finalized, walk him through the numbers, show him how it still worked out for both of us. I thought if I waited until the outcome was fixed, the conversation would be easier, cleaner, less emotional. What I didn't say, what I didn't even admit to myself at the time, was that I already knew he wouldn't agree. Not with the price, not with the timing, not with the way I had handled it. I didn't want his opinion because I didn't want to change course. So I moved forward without it. Owen ended up with his half. Everything was split the way it was supposed to be. If you look at the closing documents, nothing is missing. No money disappeared. No signatures were forged. It all lines up the way it should. That part is easy to defend. The rest of it isn't. He didn't yell when we finally sat across from each other. He didn't ask for explanations in the way I expected. He just listened, quiet in a way that made it worse, like he had already decided something before I walked in. After that, things didn't break all at once. They just stopped. First it was slower replies. Then no replies. Calls that rang out. Messages that stayed unread. Eventually I stopped trying as often, not because I didn't care, but because every attempt made it clearer that there was nothing left to recover in the way I thought there would be. Caleb left a few weeks later. He said he couldn't reconcile what I had done with the version of me he thought he knew. He didn't argue it out. He just stepped back and stayed there. I bought a place on my own after everything settled. It's smaller than what we had planned, but it's enough. There's nothing in it that ties back to the house on Willow Lane unless I choose to think about it. I sent Owen a Christmas card. No response. I don't know if he opened it. I haven't asked anyone. I'm not sure I want to hear the answer out loud. At the time, I thought I was making a necessary decision. Now it's the only one I can't undo. Before any of this mattered, the house on Willow Lane was just where everything settled. After our parents split, nothing stayed consistent for long. Schedules changed, plans fell through. People made promises they didn't always keep. The house didn't do any of that. It stayed where it was, exactly the same no matter what the rest of our lives looked like. Owen was 12 when things fell apart. I was old enough to understand what was happening, but not old enough to do anything about it. So I did what I could. I made sure he got where he needed to be. I checked his homework. I kept things from reaching him if I thought they didn't have to. It wasn't something I thought about much at the time. Just became the role I slipped into. At Willow Lane, that role felt lighter. We didn't have to manage anything there. Grandma Elaine didn't ask questions that forced answers. She filled space instead of cutting through it. The house had its own rhythm. Meals at the same time, the same chair pulled out at the table, the same quiet at night. It made things feel contained, like whatever was happening outside of it couldn't quite reach in. Owen loved that place in a way that was obvious. He attached to it quickly, like he needed something solid to hold on to. I didn't think about it the same way, not back then. To me it was where things worked. That was enough. Even later, when we were older and had our own routines, we kept coming back. Not out of obligation. It just felt easier to be there than anywhere else. After she got sick, that feeling didn't disappear. It changed, but it stayed. Owen still treated the house like it held something you couldn't replace. He moved through it carefully, like everything mattered. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything about it. There didn't seem to be a point. I didn't think of the house as something that would become a problem. At the time, it was still just a place we both assumed would always be there in some form, even if we didn't say that out loud. Looking back, that's probably where the difference started. Owen saw something worth holding on to. I saw something that would eventually have to be dealt with. When Grandma Elaine passed, the house didn't change right away. It still looked the same when we walked through it after the funeral. Same furniture, same quiet, same feeling that nothing had really ended yet. For a while, we treated it like it was just waiting for us to decide what came next. The will was straightforward. The house and the savings were split evenly between us. No conditions, no complications. Just both of our names on everything. We talked about it the way people do when they think they have time. Selling it as is would have been easy. There were buyers for houses like that even in that condition. But it didn't feel right to Owen and I didn't push back. He said we could do better if we fixed it up first. Give it a few months. Make it worth what it should be worth. I agreed. At the time it sounded reasonable. Controlled. Like something we could manage together without it turning into anything complicated. We divided things naturally. Owen took on the work itself. He arranged to step away from his job for a while so he could focus on the house full time. I kept mine and handled everything else, the paperwork, permits, calls that needed to be made. It made sense. He was better at the physical side of it. I knew how to deal with the rest. The first few weeks were uneven but not in a way that worried me. Owen learned quickly. He made mistakes, corrected them, kept going. Every time I came by, something had changed. Walls stripped down, floors uncovered. Rooms starting to look like they belonged in the present instead of another decade. We still talked like we were on the same page. We'd sit there in the evenings, eating whatever we'd picked up on the way, going over what was left to do. He'd mention timelines, ideas for finishes, things that could improve the final price. I'd nod, adjust numbers in my head, think about what it would look like when everything was done. It stayed simple for longer than it should have. There wasn't a moment where anything clearly shifted. No argument, no disagreement that marked a line. It was more gradual than that. The house started taking shape. And the closer it got to being finished, the less it felt like something neutral. Owen moved through it like it mattered in ways that weren't just about selling. He paid attention to details most buyers wouldn't notice. Took extra time on things that didn't necessarily change the price. I saw it happening but I didn't interrupt it. Not because I didn't notice. Because I didn't want to deal with what that meant if I said something out loud. We had agreed on the outcome. Renovate, sell, split everything evenly. That part never changed. But somewhere along the way, the house stopped being just a project to him. And I didn't say anything when I realized it never became one to me. I didn't tell Owen anything about my finances. Not when we first agreed to renovate. Not when he took time off work. Not when the costs started to add up in ways we both pretended were still under control. There were a dozen moments where I could have said something simple and clear, and every time I chose not to. It wasn't because I thought he wouldn't understand. It was because I didn't want him to see me differently. From the outside, everything about my life looked stable. I had a steady job, I handled my responsibilities, I didn't miss payments. That was the version of myself I had been maintaining for years. Quietly, carefully, without giving anyone a reason to question it. The truth didn't match that version anymore. There were balances I avoided looking at for too long. Small decisions that had compounded into something harder to manage. I told myself it was temporary, that it would even out eventually. It always does if you stay on top of it. That's what I believed. Except I wasn't on top of it. I was keeping it contained. That's different. Caleb didn't know everything either. Not because he hadn't asked, but because I knew exactly how much to say to keep things from shifting. We talked about the future in a way that assumed everything was in place already. Plans felt easier when they didn't include details that might complicate them. We had started looking at houses. Nothing serious at first. Just open listings, then actual visits, then conversations that felt more concrete than I was prepared for. He moved forward easily, like the next step was obvious. I kept up with him because I didn't want to slow anything down. That meant I needed everything else in my life to align quickly. The house on Willow Lane stopped being just an inheritance somewhere in the background. It became a number I couldn't ignore. A solution I didn't have to explain if I handled it correctly. I never said that out loud. Not to Caleb, not to Owen, not even in a way that felt fully formed in my own head. I kept it in smaller pieces, timing, market conditions, opportunity. Things that sounded reasonable on their own. It was easier to think of it that way. Because if I framed it differently, I would have had to admit that I was depending on something Owen still saw as personal in a way I no longer could afford to. He had the luxury of time. I didn't feel like I did. That difference didn't show up in conversations. We didn't argue about it. We didn't even acknowledge it. But it was there, sitting underneath everything we were doing, shaping how I looked at the same house he was working on every day. To him, it was something worth getting right. To me, it was something that needed to be resolved. And the longer it took, the harder it became to pretend that both of those things could exist at the same time. Nothing changed all at once. If there had been a clear moment, something obvious I could point to, I might have handled it differently. Instead, it was smaller than that. A shift in how I showed up. A slow distance that didn't look like anything at first. I stopped going by the house as often. At the beginning, I was there most evenings. I'd check what Owen had done, go over what was next, bring something for dinner so we didn't have to think about it. Felt balanced then. Like we were both carrying different parts of the same plan. That stopped feeling true somewhere along the way. Work got busier, or at least that's what I said when Owen asked why I hadn't come by. It wasn't entirely untrue. But it also wasn't the reason I was pulling back. It was easier not to be there. When I wasn't standing in the middle of it, I didn't have to engage with the pace he was setting. I didn't have to watch him spend extra time on things that didn't move us closer to selling. I didn't have to answer questions about details that, from my side, didn't matter as much as he thought they did. He still asked for my input. Paint colors, fixtures, timing. Normal decisions. The kind you make when you believe the process is still shared. I gave shorter answers. Sometimes I told him to decide. Other times I didn't respond right away, then forgot to circle back. He noticed. Not in a confrontational way. Owen isn't like that. He'd just pause a second longer when I brushed something off. Ask again like he was checking whether I was actually listening or just distracted. I told him he was overthinking things. That he didn't need to run every decision by me. It sounded supportive. Like I trusted him to handle it. And part of me did. But that wasn't why I said it. I said it because the less involved I was in the day-to-day choices, the easier it became to separate myself from the outcome I had already started moving toward. He kept working the same way he always had. Steady, focused, putting in the kind of time that only makes sense if you believe what you're building matters beyond the result. The house started looking finished. Not just repaired, but intentional. That should have made everything simpler. Instead, it made the gap harder to ignore. Because the more effort he put in, the clearer it became that we weren't working toward the same thing anymore. He thought we were getting the house ready to sell well. I had already started thinking about how quickly it could be sold. I didn't say that out loud. Not when he talked about waiting for the right moment. Not when he mentioned that a little more time could make a difference. I let those conversations pass without pushing back. And then, when it felt like enough distance had built up that it wouldn't turn into an argument I couldn't control, I made the call. Just one at first. A realtor I found through a contact at work. A conversation framed as general interest. No commitment, no decision, nothing that would force me to explain it yet. That's how I justified it. I told myself I was just gathering information. I didn't say Owen's name during that call. I didn't correct anything when the conversation leaned in a direction that made it sound like I was the one making the decisions. It was easier to let it stay that way. Because as long as it stayed informal, I didn't have to deal with what it would mean to bring him into it before I was ready. I hung up thinking it hadn't changed anything. That nothing real had happened yet. But it had. Because from that point on, I wasn't just stepping back. I was already moving in a different direction. The second call didn't feel like a decision either. Felt like a continuation. The realtor followed up a few days after we first spoke. She asked if I wanted a rough estimate. Said properties in that area were moving faster than expected. I told her I was interested. Still not committing. Still keeping it in that space where nothing had to be explained. She asked about ownership. I answered in a way that didn't invite more questions. I didn't say I was the only one involved. I didn't say Owen's name either. I kept it simple. Vague enough that the conversation moved forward without needing clarification. At the time, it felt like avoiding something minor. Looking back, that was the point where I knew exactly what I was doing. I just chose not to stop. The estimate came back higher than I expected. Higher than what we would have gotten without the work Owen had already done. That should have confirmed the plan we started with: finish everything, sell later, maximize it. Instead, it made something else feel possible. If the house could move at that price now, there was no guarantee it would hold. Markets shift. Interest changes. Timing matters. I started thinking in those terms because they supported the direction I was already leaning toward. Not because anyone had told me I needed to act quickly. Because I wanted to. The first offer came in quietly. No listing yet, just interest. Someone looking in that area, willing to move fast if the numbers made sense. The realtor brought it to me as an option. No pressure. Just information. That's how I let it stay in my head. An option. I didn't tell Owen. He was still working on the house every day. Still treating it like the finish line mattered. I watched him move through it the same way he always had, focused on what was left to do instead of what could already be done. I told myself I would talk to him if the offer became serious. That was the line I set. It didn't hold for long. The buyer came back with numbers. Not the highest possible, but clean. No delays, no conditions that would drag things out. It was exactly the kind of offer that removes uncertainty. That mattered more to me than the difference in price. I didn't compare it to what we might have gotten later. I compared it to what I needed things to look like now. That's the calculation I made. I accepted. Not in a single moment where everything felt final, but through a series of smaller confirmations that built on each other. A message returned. A document reviewed. A date suggested, then agreed to. Each step felt manageable on its own. Taken together, they moved everything forward faster than anything Owen could have influenced. Even if he had known. The listing went up after that. Public, visible, real. He still didn't know. Caleb did. He wasn't supposed to, not at first. He saw something on my screen one evening when we were sitting together. Asked a question that I answered too quickly, without thinking through how much I was revealing. He didn't react right away. He just asked if Owen knew. I told him I hadn't had the chance to explain it yet. That was the first time I said it out loud in a way that couldn't be softened. He didn't accept it the way I expected him to. He didn't argue the numbers. He didn't question the timing. He focused on one thing: why I had moved this far without telling my own brother. I tried to frame it the way I had in my head. That it was easier to finalize things before bringing emotion into it. That the outcome would be the same either way. That I was preventing a conversation that would only slow everything down. He didn't agree. He said it wasn't about timing or efficiency. It was about whether I thought Owen deserved to be part of the decision. I didn't answer that directly. Because if I had, I would have had to admit something I wasn't ready to say. Caleb told me I needed to tell him. Not eventually. Not after closing. Now. I said I would. I didn't. I told myself I needed one more day. One more step completed so I could explain everything cleanly. So I wouldn't have to backtrack or renegotiate anything I had already set in motion. Caleb didn't wait. He called Owen himself. By the time I realized what he'd done, it didn't matter what version of the explanation I had been trying to construct. Owen already knew. I didn't answer his calls that day. Not because I didn't see them. I saw every one. I watched them come in one after another, spaced just far enough apart that I knew he was giving me time to pick up. I let them ring out anyway. I told myself I needed to speak to him in person. That anything said over the phone would turn into something I couldn't control. That if I waited, I could explain it properly. By the time we sat down across from each other, I already knew that wasn't true. Owen didn't start with questions. He just looked at me for a second longer than usual, like he was trying to match what he knew now with who I had been before. Then he asked quietly if it was true. I said yes. There wasn't a version of that answer that made anything better. I tried to explain after that. I talked about timing, about the offer being solid, about how fast things could move when everything aligned. I kept my voice even, like if I stayed calm enough, the situation might follow. He didn't interrupt. That made it harder. Because there was no pushback to react to, no argument to manage. Just silence that left space for everything I was saying to land exactly as it was. When I finished, he asked one thing. Why I hadn't told him. Not why I accepted the offer. Not why I thought it was a good idea. Just why I had done all of it without him. I gave him the answer I had been building. That I knew he would want to wait. That he would want to keep working on the house, make it perfect, push for more. That the opportunity we had wouldn't stay the same forever. That I was trying to make sure we didn't lose it. He didn't react to any of that. He just kept looking at me. And for a second I almost stopped there. Almost. But something in me pushed further, like if I added enough context, it would make the decision feel justified instead of deliberate. I told him I had been carrying more of this than he realized. That things hadn't been as simple on my end as they looked. that I didn't have the same flexibility he did. It wasn't a full explanation, just enough to suggest there was more without actually saying it. He let that sit between us for a moment, then asked if I had ever planned to tell him before everything was already done. I said I was going to. He didn't ask when. He didn't have to, because the answer was already obvious. That was when I said it. Not the part about the money. Not the part about Caleb. Something else, something easier to reach for in the moment. I told him I had been dealing with more than just the house for a long time. That after everything with Grandma, I wasn't going to let this turn into something that dragged on indefinitely. The second it left my mouth, I knew it wasn't what he was asking for. It wasn't even really about him. It was the closest thing I had to something that sounded like a reason without exposing everything underneath it. Owen didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't list out what I had done or how it looked from his side. He just sat there, absorbing it like he was confirming something he had already started to understand. We went to the closing a few weeks later. Everything moved the way it was supposed to. Papers signed, numbers transferred, keys handed over. Clean. Final. We stood next to each other through all of it, speaking only when necessary. When it was done, he didn't stay. He said he had to get back to work. I told him we should talk later. He said maybe. That was the last time anything between us sounded open-ended. For a couple of weeks after the closing, I told myself it hadn't ended. Owen wasn't responding, but that didn't feel final yet. People need space. That's what I kept repeating. Space doesn't mean done. Just means later. I sent a few messages. Nothing heavy. Just things that could exist without needing a reply. Updates, small pieces of normal conversation, anything that might keep a line open. He didn't answer any of them. Caleb still tried at first. He asked if I was going to fix it. Not in a confrontational way, just directly, like he expected me to have a plan. I told him I needed time, that Owen would come around once things settled. He didn't push after that. That should have told me something. The next time I saw Tessa, she didn't act any differently at the start. We talked the way we always did. It stayed like that long enough for me to think maybe everything was still contained. Then she asked me about the house. Not casually. Not like she was curious. Like she already knew more than she was saying. I kept my answer simple. That it sold, that everything worked out, that Owen and I had handled it. She didn't let it end there. She asked when I had decided to sell. The way she said it made it clear she wasn't asking for the timeline I had been giving everyone else. I told her things had moved quickly. She held eye contact a second longer than normal, then said she had heard something different. That I had been talking to a realtor earlier than I'd said. That I had let the process move forward without telling Owen. I didn't deny it. There wasn't a version of that conversation where denying it would have held. What I didn't expect was what came next. She said that wasn't even the part that bothered her. She said it was the way I had described it to someone else. Like I was the one in control of everything. Like Owen wasn't really part of it in a meaningful way. I told her that wasn't what I meant. Even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. Because whether I meant it or not didn't change how I had acted. That conversation didn't stay between us. Owen called me a few days later. This time I picked up. He didn't ease into it. He asked if I had ever planned to tell him the truth about how early everything started. Not the version I gave him at the restaurant. The full timeline. I didn't answer right away. He took that as his answer. Then he asked something else. If I had ever considered not giving him his full share. I told him no. Came out too fast. He didn't argue with me about it. Didn't try to prove anything. He just said that other people seemed to think differently. That was the moment everything shifted from something I could still shape into something I couldn't control anymore. Because it wasn't just between us. It wasn't just about what I had done. It was about what people believed I had been willing to do. I tried to explain again. I said things had been complicated. That I had been trying to manage everything at once. That it hadn't been as clear-cut as it looked. He didn't respond to any of that. He just said he was done trying to understand it. After that, he stopped reaching out completely. Not gradually this time. Just gone. Caleb lasted a little longer. He didn't leave immediately after that call, but something in him had already pulled back. Conversations became shorter. Plans felt less certain. He stopped talking about the future in the same way. When he finally ended it, he didn't bring up the house directly. He said he couldn't build something stable with someone who handled things the way I had. That was all. No argument. No attempt to fix it. Just a decision. The rest of it spread the way things always do. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough that when I walked into a room, I could feel the difference in how people spoke to me. Slight pauses. Careful wording. Questions that didn't go too far. No one confronted me directly. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been decided elsewhere. And for the first time since this started, there wasn't anything left for me to manage. I stopped trying to reach him after that. Not all at once. First, I told myself I was giving it time. That if I didn't push, if I let things settle, something might reopen on its own. But the longer I waited, the more it felt like I was waiting for something that had already passed. The silence didn't shift. It didn't soften, didn't turn into anything else. It just stayed where it was, steady and complete in a way that made it harder to question. There was no anger left in it. No frustration I could respond to. Just absence. I wrote him a letter. Not a message, not something quick I could send and retract if it felt wrong. Something slower. I tried to say things clearly this time. Not just what had happened, but why I had let it happen the way I did. I didn't include everything. There were still parts one couldn't bring myself to put down in words. I left it at that. No follow-up, no second attempt to clarify. I didn't hear back. For a while, I asked about him through other people. Not directly, not in a way that sounded like I was asking for updates. Just small questions scattered into conversation, looking for anything that told me where he was in his life. That stopped too. Not because I lost interest, but because I realized I wasn't entitled to that information anymore. The space he put between us wasn't accidental. It was something he was maintaining on purpose. I started noticing changes in smaller ways. Invitations that felt optional instead of assumed. Conversations that didn't quite settle the way they used to. No one said anything outright, but I could tell that people were adjusting around me the same way they do when something has shifted and no one wants to name it directly. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't offer a different version of what happened. There wasn't one that held up. The place I bought after everything went through is quiet. Smaller than what Caleb and I had talked about before, but enough for one person. It doesn't carry anything with it unless I bring it there myself. Sometimes I think about the house on Willow Lane. Not the sale, not the numbers. Just the way it used to feel before any of this mattered. I don't stay on that thought long. There isn't anything useful in it. I saw Owen once after all of this. Not a conversation. Not something arranged. Just across a room at a family gathering I almost didn't go to. He looked the same. Different in ways I couldn't define, but not in a way anyone else would notice. He didn't come over. He didn't avoid me either. He just stayed where he was. That was enough. I sent a Christmas card at the end of the year. I didn't write much inside it. There didn't seem to be a point in trying to say something new when the last thing I had said hadn't changed anything. I didn't expect a response. Still, I checked the mailbox more than I needed to. Nothing came back. I don't know if he opened it. I don't know if he threw it away without looking, or set it aside and never came back to it. I've thought about asking someone, but I haven't. Some answers don't change anything once you already understand what they mean. I used to think the hardest part of this would be explaining it. Finding the right way to lay everything out so it made sense, so it didn't feel as final as it looked from the outside. That part never came. There wasn't a version of this that could be explained into something acceptable. Not to him, and eventually not to me either. What's left now is simpler than that. I made a decision I couldn't reverse. Not the sale itself. That part is done, filed away, easy to point to if someone asks for facts. The part one can't change is everything around it. The way I chose to move forward without him. The way I kept going even when I knew what it would cost. He has his life now. I hear things occasionally. Enough to know he's doing fine. That he went back to work. That he's settled into something steady again. That he's building something that doesn't include me in it. I don't reach into that anymore. I don't have a place there. The house on Willow Lane belongs to someone else now. It's been changed. Updated. It doesn't look like anything we remember unless you know exactly where to look. That feels right. It's not ours anymore. Neither is what came with it. I thought at the time that I was making the only decision that worked. Now it's the only one that stayed.